Is there anyone in the room that does not understand Portuguese? So I can speak Portuguese? Muito boa tarde a todos. Eu vou evitar falar o portunhol, que é sempre aquela língua mais estranha. Eu vou falar mesmo em português, mas de facto, quando vi este programa do Lost in Translation e este encontro, este meeting destes grupos ibéricos que trabalham sobre temas de estudos de ciência e tecnologia, estudos sociais de ciência e tecnologia, a primeira questão foi exatamente, mas em que língua é que vai decorrer? Fiquei aliviado ao ver a tradução nas diversas línguas ibéricas e, portanto, percebi que entre os organizadores que a Ana Delicado em catalão é Ana Delicat, mas que em basco é Ana Delicadoc, se não me engano, e que o Luís Junqueira, que está aqui, que mantém o Junqueira em catalão, mas em basco já é Junqueira qualquer coisa, e portanto significa que há um problema no Lost in Translation que tem a ver com os próprios nomes dos organizadores, mas se aqui o referi é justamente para que haja um agradecimento desde o início àqueles que, segundo o próprio programa, mais trabalharam para tornar possível este encontro. Portanto, à Ana e ao Luís, um agradecimento por terem tornado possível, em nome do Instituto, e é com muito gosto que já agora peço para se associarem a essa referência. A segunda palavra que gostaria de dizer é a pena que eu tenho de não poder estar durante estes próximos dias aqui convosco a debater e a acompanhar o vosso trabalho, que é um trabalho que a mim pessoalmente me interessa do ponto de vista das minhas áreas de investigação. Também tenho trabalhado sobre a tradução enquanto forma de apropriação do conhecimento científico, e neste caso há uma palavra que falta no vosso título, que é a palavra ideias. A mim tem-me interessado sobretudo trabalhar não apenas sobre conceitos, práticas e métodos, mas também sobre ideias e sobre como é que as ideias circulam, como é que elas se adaptam, como é que elas são apropriadas e como é que elas são traduzidas, e como é que o processo de tradução, aplicado neste caso concreto às ideias económicas, é importante para perceber todas as práticas científicas em diversos níveis e, aplicando isto ao século XVIII, como é que a tradução de textos económicos está associada a transformações técnicas científicas nos domínios da agronomia, por exemplo, ou nos domínios das aplicações ao domínio agrícola. E essa é uma área de trabalho científico que muito me interessa, e por isso a oportunidade de, com especialistas na área dos estudos sociais da ciência e da tecnologia, poder estar aqui, digamos, a beneficiar das vossas contribuições seria para mim muito mais agradável do que ter que regressar à reunião do Conselho Científico do STS e do que amanhã ter que acompanhar a Comissão de Acompanhamento Externo, que está a fazer uma visita ao programa de doutoramento em História que eu coordeno. E por isso, há outro colóquio amanhã aqui também vai ter lugar sobre o populismo, que é também um colóquio que vai mobilizar muitas pessoas. Isto mostra, de algum modo, a vitalidade de uma instituição como o Instituto de Ciências Sociais, que nos acolhe, e para mim é muito grato eu poder fazer este papel, que é agradecer em nome do Instituto a todos aqueles que fazem a vida do Instituto. Às vezes tenho que pensar duas vezes se estou a falar no colóquio do populismo ou no colóquio dos estudos sociais da ciência ou no colóquio do transgénero, mas com alguma capacidade lá vou tentando adequar aquilo que digo ao ambiente próprio de cada uma das sessões de trabalho. Mas era isto que vos queria aqui dizer, que é um imenso benefício e privilégio para o ICS poder acolher reuniões como esta. Desejar-vos bom trabalho e, sinceramente, creio que é com imensa pena que não vou ficar mais tempo convosco, mas de facto não é possível. Bom trabalho, obrigado por estarem aqui e the floor is yours.
Boa tarde a todos. Chamo-me Helder Raposo e, em conjunto com a Ana Delicado e com a Cristina Conceição, coordeno a secção temática de Ciência, Conhecimento e Tecnologia da Associação Portuguesa de Sociologia. Nesta sessão inaugural, vou apresentar-vos algumas palavras de boas-vindas, mas decidi fazê-lo em inglês como língua franca, dado que assegura que alguns aspectos não ficam, digamos assim, equivocados. Pronto, dito isto, então, passaria a ler-vos aqui uma curta mensagem de acolhimento e de votos de que este início do nosso evento possa, de facto, augurar o maior sucesso. On behalf of the Scientific Committee of this first joint meeting of the Spanish and the Portuguese STS networks, I would like to welcome you to this innovative initiative. We aim to start an important stage of collaboration between these two networks that, either in Spain as in Portugal, have built a relevant path of scientific and academic development in the area of science and technology studies. In order to overcome distance resulting from the existence of certain boundaries, in particular geographic and linguistic ones, it is intended not only to foster greater dialogue and reciprocal knowledge, but above all, to consolidate practice of collaboration. This is important in order to address new challenges and opportunities at the level of research networks and their agendas. It is also an opportunity to think and align strategies that help us to best adapt to the dynamics of a reality that has become more volatile and in many ways more adverse and demanding in relation to academic work, namely at the level of public funding of science or the new performative logics of publication. As highlighted in the text of the organizing committee that is on the program of this meeting, it is important to think about the new challenge of the political, social and economic changes, especially because these have affected the countries of Southern Europe in specific ways. This is particularly visible in terms of budget cuts, migrations and lack of public investment in science. As a consequence of these, new pressures and demands also arise for greater flows and mobilities between spaces and boundaries. We hope that these 3 days of work will be just the beginning of a new path based on future collaborations. It is an inspiring horizon that could make STS more solid and visible in each of the countries, but also with a more ambitious scale as a result of a more interdependent development. Thank you.
Okay, now I'll speak directly in English. This is very awkward. I didn't think I had to talk today because I just didn't think about this. Anyway, I think I may say a couple of words about what is the network for STS, the Spanish network for STS, or better, the red EsCTS, because we are an anomaly. We are something that should not exist, according to the literature at least. We are a network that has no juridical status. We do not exist on paper. We are only a group of people that meet almost every year, that share a lot of interests, that somehow help each other, that listen to each other, cry with each other sometimes. And we share this desire to think science, technology, and society differently every time in a new way with academic and non-academic actors. This is another important aspect of our network. We have been few, we have been many, and we have changed almost every year. I mean, today it's me staying here with Sara, who has joined us last year together with Merichel and others, Sara Perez somewhere and there. Basically, this network is what people make of it every year. There are different people. Some of them are always there, like me, but others change and make a great contribution every year. We keep existing despite all the odds, and we are here. So the second part of what I want to say is that I wanted to express my gratitude to Ana Delicado and the Portuguese friends and colleagues who have been willing to host this event here. We have been thinking about this for years actually. We had the first discussion about this in Salamanca now 3 years ago, and eventually we found a way to make this happen. So hopefully these 3 days are going to be a moment in which we could share more with our Portuguese friends and think yet another way of remaking this network. I don't think there's more to say than that, honestly. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, with all of you. I don't know whether Sarah or Reset want to say a few words about her experience in the network, because she's the network as much as I am, as much any one of us. And up to you.
Just hi everyone and welcome. And I've been dragged here just to represent the other people that join in, because every year these changes. So it was just like a moment that we thought, yeah, we'll do this. We know what these people do and why not. So it's just like coming together, something that happened in a very spontaneous way and just carried through all the months. And yeah, maybe we represent the invisible work, the backstage that has happened before we get together here. And just basically like our little image here with the bus, which is here on a tourist trip, getting together and mixing languages and discipline. So enjoy the trip. And that's all.
So just a few words. Now we have, don't worry, we have to switch off the light a little bit. We are preparing a little performance before we start with our round table. So if the lights are off, do not worry. Everything is okay.
Yes. Tell me when I can start.
I can do that. I can do that. I think it's better if I do.
Diego is sleeping and is having nightmares. Yesterday he was offered yet another postdoc abroad, and he doesn't know what to do, whether to accept it and move again, or reject it and keep searching for some academics opportunity at home, despite he sometimes doesn't know where that is. Both scenarios are tempting, both are terrifying too. He wants to pursue an academic career, but he's concerned about living abroad again and about dropping any chance to contribute scientifically to his own academic community at home, in his own language, addressing issues that are relevant to his society. Also, he's worried about what that might be doing to him, distancing from and potentially losing the friends and colleagues beyond academia he knows, how to think with in the collective he has been part of, but also putting his personal life on hold yet again. He believes that leaving his own country again means that this is time that this time would be for good, and he considered that even if successful abroad, something will be lost in translation. Yet, remaining is also a problem. He may not get any chance to pursue such a career at home, or he may need to move forward amidst permanent precariousness of jobs, salary and opportunities. He may end up dropping academia and adapting somewhere in the private sector, doing some research for an R&D company, perhaps, but without freedom to research and without freedom to publish either. Or having to go against all odds and starting up the social research cooperative he has been constantly talking about with some friends in the last 5 years. The idea seems tempting, but where would they be getting the funds from? Would they be turning their life in a total nightmare, tangling themselves in something that might not be granting the freedom they all seek? Again, something would be lost in this translation, too.
Marina now has the work of her dreams. She just moved to Denmark and was offered a lecturer position in STS with what they call a small fund for her research. A small fund! With the little money she's being given, not only she could travel and go to several conferences, she will also be able to hire people to work with, like a research assistant. And who knows? If the project they were talking about in the department meeting last week goes well, maybe she could even hire a 3-year PhD student and a 2-year postdoc researcher. This looks like balaha to her. Sure, having to teach in English looked like climbing Mount Everest at first, but now she's got all the freedom in the world to prepare her workshops and seminars. There's no need to repeat the same old bullshit introduction to whatever courses that she had to teach in the Faculty of Sociology back in Spain, where no one gave a shit about STS or feminist technoscience studies. And also, colleagues in Denmark are certainly not the same kinds of colleagues than in Spain. Marina is thrilled because everyone seems to be asking her opinion, wanting to know how she would do things, whether she could contribute to anything this or that. Yet, sadness creeps in every night when in her beautiful IKEA flat she scrapes home to talk to her parents. And yes, there is still home, and she never knows what to make of this beautiful place where she now lives in. Marina's father was hospitalized 2 weeks ago, and she doesn't know how to handle this.
Já passaram 6 meses desde que a Laura voltou e sente-se um pouco à neira. Os primeiros meses passaram a correr, entre a alegria de estar em casa e o trabalho novo, com colegas com quem se manteve em contato durante os anos que esteve fora. Mas agora, as dúvidas tornam-se insistentes. Será que vai funcionar? Terá sido impulsiva? Afinal de contas, os outros amigos lá fora desejaram-lhe boa sorte, mas não viam condições para voltar. Os financiamentos são incertos. Há anos em que abrem concursos de projetos e outros não. E quando abrem, a taxa de aprovação é tão baixa que valerá sequer a pena concorrer, sobretudo em áreas científicas que não trazem patentes nem colaborações com empresas. E não há garantias que no final do contrato de trabalho isto seja renovado, mesmo que tenha feito muito boa investigação. E vai ser complicado manter as redes de colaboração e o ritmo de publicação com tantas aulas e tarefas burocráticas. E depois, pessoalmente, não foi fácil. A namorada ficou longe e tem mais saudades da vida que deixou do que esperava. A Laura, tendo encontrado o rumo de volta a casa, sente-se perdida entre os 2 sítios e as 2 culturas. Pergunta-se se tomou a decisão certa. Mas não crescemos a ouvir que tudo vale a pena?
Antonio se ha mudado recientemente a las afueras de Madrid, junto junto con sus 2 hijos y su mujer, que trabaja como autónomo en una empresa de viajes. Incluso con los 2 sueldos ya no les daba para vivir en Chamartín. Las cosas en su empresa no van mal, aparentemente, pero Antonio está preocupado porque los proyectos europeos que han ganado son de muy difícil cumplimiento. Han prometido resultados que no van a poder conseguir. Y además, está solo trabajando en un proyecto donde en teoría debían estar trabajando 4 investigadores de plantilla. La realidad es que tienen contratado como autónomo a un becario que hace lo que puede, pero eso no basta. Las últimas entregas de resultados han sido un desastre. La comisión los ha rechazado y él tuvo que poner cara de póker en la reunión del consorcio. Como siga así, les van a suspender el proyecto y quizá incluso les pidan el dinero de vuelta. A él le encanta su trabajo de investigador y en principio en la empresa iba a tener dinero para hacer cosas que en la universidad, vamos, imposible. Además ahora tiene un trabajo fijo después de tantos años de inestabilidad y puede seguir adelante con su familia. Pero ya no encuentra tiempo para publicar, no le dejan investigar algunos temas a los que llevaba años dando vueltas y echa de menos a sus colegas, los congresos, los retos intelectuales de la academia. Pero basta ya de esta nostalgia, que en la universidad no tenía futuro y qué iba a hacer con 2 niños pequeños. Bueno, a descansar, que mañana hay que llevar a los niños al cole.
And you, Diego, what kind of postdoc will you be?
É mais uma mesa redonda do que os discursos de abertura tradicionais. Eu vou passar, em primeiro lugar, a palavra ao Tomás Sánchez Criado, depois à Ana Viseu e, por fim, ao Tiago Moreira. Muito rapidamente, o Tomás é Senior Researcher at the Munich Center for Technology and Society, at the Technical University of Munich. He's a social anthropologist with a specialization in STS, whose studies and publications have focused monographically on the ethnographic exploration of the modern human transformations of care practices through an analysis of prototyping, installation, maintenance and repair, and redesign of different corporate, institutional and activist ecologies of support in Europe, with a focus in Spain. Tomás? You have 20 minutes, and I'll be very short.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here and in such a good presence. I will jump directly into what I wanted to share with you today, that I have loosely titled Two Crises in and with STS. And in my intervention in this debate, I would like to profit this occasion to mumble, rather to think aloud, on the process of moving from the uber-activist and hyper-collective intellectual milieu of Spain under austerity in the last years to the context of a pacified hyper-capitalist and entrepreneurial public university in Munich, and into a new STS center of Germany, the new STS center of Germany, to be more specific. So I will try to articulate my own experience, even though I will not try to do that as an autobiographical reflection, but as a mode of eliciting how moving has made apparent two crises in and with how STS could be practiced and what it might be for. I'll use what these crises opened up to try out an analytic of how we could go beyond translation as a mode of maybe paradoxically making us experience being lost in translation. And we'll try to put forward how re-specification rather than translation might be conveying a more interesting stance into forms of interventive and experimental engagement with the political issues of STS and its form and content. So, my first crisis was with STS as is. But I think this was a particularly collective one. I mean, a very particular collective crisis. Without any intention to speak for anyone, my interpretation is that a space like the EsCTS network, an open, allegedly hierarchically flat, and voluntarily interdisciplinary network, was needed for many reasons. First, because most of us were alone, like lost children, without any kind of institutional backing or context to share our interest in a rather minoritarian field, having to work within or under the framework of highly institutionalized disciplines. Hence, a network as a form of relatedness allowed building bridges between traditions, locales, and diverging modes of doing things which had many reasons to be in a potential dialogue: actor network theory, feminist technoscience studies, science and society, history of science and technology, innovation studies, etc. But second, a network was quintessential to break even with the Game of Thrones-ish situation of post-Francoist academia, or with the vast precariousness of means most of us have been plunging in since we started our career as social scientists, which has not only grown worse and worse. For this, a network with no membership and allowing hybrid and impure connections helped many people relate or even to articulate better their multiple belongings and commitments. Third, these statute might have been part of a wider and even deeper stance that a more vernacular take on STS was needed, since these widely Anglo-Saxon discipline, hence dominated by many times foreign or estranged institutional, political, historical, and academic institutional concerns, was not really helping many of us to relate to our topics of interest, our surroundings, and even our incipient tradition of vernacular thought. Very relevant in the form and composition of a mutable and changing network, allowing people to keep doing stuff, as well as in the types of debates that are taking place, might have been the vicinity in its early stages with the 15M, the multifarious indignados events, and the gigantic experimentation that has been taking place in forms of collective action. But also the relevance and importance that for many people in the network, transfeminist studies, disability studies, artivism, and their ethical and political stances might be having. As much as it had affected other spaces, I mean the 15M, this became an important factor in allowing for other forms of the possible, the sayable, and the thinkable, to name but a few of the attributes Jacques Rancière uses to define politics. Using irony and play, the very network started to become even a space for the recursive experimentation with STS, affecting its form and content. And throughout the years, the network has produced its own vernacular lingo. The network has been considered to be something of a prototype of other forms of academia, as an interventionist and experimental space to care for formats and spatial modes of encounter with others, a particularly distributed and uneven mode of searching to articulate the different ecologies of practice we have been inhabiting as researchers, activists, or regular lay people, together with others. I think spaces of the like should not necessarily be thought of as effects of situations of economic crisis. I believe another kind of crisis, much more important, is why people feel the need to open up spaces of the like and what potentialities they might have. And maybe the wider crisis of legitimacy of academia as an autonomous and disengaged endeavor. We could use here the much abused ivory tower epithet, and in particular of scientific societies as infrastructures of collective thought and mutual support might be a more apt rendering. If I had to define what the network has meant for me, it has been a space making available to think on our research situation in terms of form and content. That is, addressing the singularity of a particular thematic distribution of topics, as well as the commitment many people had in a close dialogue with, or even because of their belonging to activist spaces. But also forging relevant local concepts, formats as relevant modes of addressing not only conceptual or not only linguistic modes of expression, as well as experimenting with how to foster dialogues with non-academic spaces. And however nice or cool these spaces have always been, however much they allowed us to talk and do things in more vernacular terms, these were never spaces devoid of troubles, hierarchies, or privileges. Besides, the rampant precariousness has not disappeared, and the network has only allowed people to keep connected even when they were losing their jobs or working under horrible conditions. I won't deny the importance of attempts at articulating and finding ways to express it have made people feel less lonely in very complex times. But, so despite many attempts at translating that loss that we felt, these translations into the form of a network haven't stopped the erosion of living under such, let's say, neoliberal conditions. But that leads me to the second crisis, and many of us kept on searching. Some left and some stayed, either because they cared more for the non-career aspects of their lives, or because they couldn't or wouldn't or shouldn't leave, with no intention whatsoever of becoming a model or an example of anything, but just as a way to have an entry point into a wider argument. Let me talk about my case. After a while, and thinking there was no exit and that I needed a change, I started searching for jobs abroad. After a year of search, I was lucky enough to be offered a better paid position in a well-funded institution with very nice and clever colleagues, and the opportunity to travel and share my work. Of course, I could here delve into many of the classic tropes from the 1960s, the migrating Spaniard to Germany, condensed in films and popular myths. And for the most of the first year, I drowned in some versions of them, feeling really lucky, but also really lonely, because I traded many things to become an academic migrant. I mean, this is nothing most of the people here in the audience, you know much better than I do. But everything seemed different, from growing accustomed to thinking together, to being treated as an individual and isolated researcher who should be taking care of his career. From the abundance of possibilities and freedom I had experienced, despite funding and job scarcity, to a strange feeling of impossibility in a place of comfort and financial abundance. However, the funniest thing is I was hired precisely because I could bring more experimental democracy and collective takes on STS issues to help deal with user needs and some of the methods and formats I had learned in my work with design activists in Spain. The problem is I knew no German, even everything was said to happen in English, but that wasn't the case. And of course, I knew nothing of the local context or the issues and problems that people in Munich have. However paradoxical it might seem, I was again lost in translation, since I had to face the many difficulties or sheer impossibilities of translating the modes of thinking and doing I had learned in the previous years to a context I couldn't relate to. In fact, the stupid idea of believing I could do it has made me feel a great sense of loss in many a dark night. I have also had to face my naivete or sheer audacity in having forgotten that institutional spaces of alleged financial or funding abundance are not devoid of other problems of scarcity. A chronic lack of time, a potential lack of care for the life of others, institutional or research peers, maybe all of it created by a focus on individual career, not to speak of the problems of how well-greased hierarchies operate in places of monetary power. In any case, my biggest yet small, or maybe to say it better, attainable struggle to date has been trying to translate the politics of activist design collectives into a pedagogic agenda for the architects and designers I have been teaching to. Indeed, together with some of the members of the team, we have become interested in addressing how to turn the STS program of technical democracy, or the techno-scientific democratizations we have been researching on, into something like a teaching technicians to behave otherwise program. What a challenge. But a very interesting one, working from the belly of the Bavarian beast, the leading German polytechnic university at the core of one of the golden cradles of global corporate capitalism. Siemens, Volkswagen, always populating everything. In a way, we are searching to translate STS-minded issues into a way of affecting the future technicians, professionals, or experts. Indeed, we could say that this is nothing more than a pedagogic stance of one of the old aims of the field, to intervene technocracy. And in the last 2 years, we have been experimenting with different trials, or should I say somewhat failures, in capturing the students' attention or in making them care about some of these things beyond ready-made humanitarian gestures, since either students seemed uninterested because we were not helping them to be more employable in the job market they searched to working, or the teaching methods based on reading and commenting have proven inappropriate, not to speak of the complex conditions we're in relations of co-teaching with other architects who use us as nothing more than problem solvers, or who sometimes hijack our very efforts, overruling us, creating technical social divides. We have to deal with the social, not with the technical. But little by little, we've had to transform our expectations and searching to find collaborations elsewhere. Our trials have helped us relate with other architects from other places that seem to use a kind of common language and who are helping us address how we could put their modes of design in crisis. Indeed, that is the exploration I'm searching to unfold in the last course we're teaching, titled Design in Crisis, Coming to Our Senses. In it, I'm trying to make them aware of multisensory aspects of design, searching to teach them through sensory experiments and practices, techniques, tools and devices I have come across in my ethnographic work on inclusive urbanism. My aim is to make them collectively prototype a new architectural toolkit, a toolkit for a blind architect, to be more specific. That is, a set of devices, methods and skills necessary to re-equip their very architectural practice at the same time that we make them come to their senses, in both senses of the term. So far, the results in their embodied transformation make me a bit hopeful that we might have found a potential prototype to start addressing the issue, at least with our students from different European countries, not with the German ones, that never come to our class. And we are trying to document this experience, to be able to share it and discuss it with some other colleagues from different countries to address this very issue. How to teach STS to designers or architects when you cannot properly teach them the lingo nor the readings. Okay, so far so good, but who do we share it with? And how in the very place we work in? I mean, who's listening? Unfortunately, there's no one at the end of the line yet, but who knows? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe am I again lost in translation? But the previous two tales, I believe, share something. They show two situations of a crisis with regards to STS and an attempt at changing its forms and contents, where we can witness the sheer complexities of pretending to generate overall conditions of change or transformations through these meager trials and proposals, the joyful and horizontal politics of a prototypical network into transformations at the level of institutions, in the first case, or the contained, narrow, and humble teaching experiments searching to make more sensitive students who never felt they needed us, and nobody knows if they are ever going to use what we made them do in the second one. Situations of translation that no wonder work somehow imperfectly and in strange ways. Yet we have to resist the temptation of falling into despair and believing that all we ever do is reaching dead ends. In a way, this was an old A&T tenet, dwelling on the common Latin etymology of translation and treason, which has been captured beautifully in the Italian adagio traduttore traditore, showing the difficulties and the many cases of untranslatability. But I'd like to conclude in a less bleak tone by briefly exploring another trope I think could help us address better what is at stake, or even find a way to discuss what STS might be allowing us, maybe even here in this very meeting, what STS might be allowing us to do when we want to intervene the form, format, and content of our ecology of practices and that of our counterparts in moments of being lost in translation. In both cases, what I think is at stake is not how to scale up or merely transpose methods, ideas from one place to another, but how to learn the local art of re-specifying. What if that was our task, permanently, whenever we move from one place, discipline, or context to another? That is, to re-specify our goals and aims, which means that we have to recalibrate and relearn from the context in which we operate. This might sound pretty obvious, but that I think that is a way to create conditions of change so that we could try to enact openings. In all fairness, none of the two stories I told could be named failures. Indeed, they show that situations have a degree of play, however difficult it might be to find the appropriate tension in which they might be meaningful. To re-specify might be to open pores, networks, modes of being together and caring for each other's arguments. Something like third spaces, that is, spaces that are neither fully academic nor fully non-academic, neither fully anthropological nor fully architectural, to use my examples. That is, what if we were to be always opening up spaces in between? What if the only way in which our experiences from one place to another could work was to endlessly open up such third spaces without wanting to take control of them? In a way, that was the Zapatista issue, changing the world without taking power. However, and precisely in that very same Zapatista sense, I don't mean any of these as an apostle of anything. This would have to be a collective endeavor. A third space always has to be about the concrete and the singular, about what happens, what gathers us in a common experiential tissue. So it cannot be premised on what happened elsewhere. These third spaces should be premised on what in the book In Defense of School, Maskelyne and Simmons called free time, which, by the way, is the Greek etymology for the English term school, skole. And that is what those third spaces, those pores or networks, are about, lending us time, giving time to each other. Otherwise, there is no learning, because in a way, learning cannot be but to become another, to share our conditions of study with others. These third spaces I am referring to only work when they are characterized by their intimacy and a certain trust, the intimacy to fail and to err together. And because of that, they take an awful lot of time to develop, and a lot of care, since they are constantly on the verge of being shut down. But the experimentation they afford might indeed open up potentialities, modes of doing and mutually sustaining each other in bleak times like this. Could we, now, here, open up one of these spaces? How do we start? Thank you.
Next, we have Ana Viseu. She's an associate professor at Universidade and a member of the Centro Interuniversitário de História das Ciências e Tecnologia da Faculdade de Ciências. In 2011, she became a Marie Curie Fellow in Portugal, and in 2013, she left York University in Canada, where she was assistant professor in the Department of Communications. She received a PhD from the University of Toronto in 2005, with a dissertation that examined the multiple and conflicted meanings of bodily augmentation through wearable computers, and went on to be a research associate at Cornell University, USA. Anchoring her thinking in cultural studies of technoscience, feminist technoscience, and science and technology studies, she specializes in ethnographic studies of technoscientific innovation. Anna, the floor is yours. Okay. Well, you have to.
I just need to. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking you guys for inviting me to be here, and in particular, I want to thank Anna, who is really one of the greatest movers and shakers of STS in Portugal. And this is a strange format that we're working here, so you have to bear with me. I was asked to talk about boundaries, about borders, and about translations, to think about how these have affected and shaped me, and correspondingly how they have shaped my work. And I will do that, but before, give me a few seconds to tell you a bit about my work, what I do, and how I ended up in this place. And it may sound a bit as self-promotion, and I'm not very happy to do this, but there is a point to this story. I am now, as Ana said, an associate professor at Universidade, a small private university here in Lisbon. And I define my work as being squarely in the field of STS, of Science and Technology Studies. But in particular, I think I owe most of my intellectual roots to the work of feminist scholars like Donna Haraway or Lucy Sussman, among others. And this matters to me. Feminist scholars have long been preoccupied and attentive to issues of knowledge and power, to who gets to participate, to do the knowing and to do the talking. They have kept a careful eye to who gets left behind, who is the marginal other, and that's something that I have brought with me to study the world of high tech, the world of production of emergent technologies. I specialize in scientific ethnographies, so empirical studies of the material and discursive practices of techno-scientific development, use, and governance. And so with this double approach, I try to do to bring together the theoretical and the material, to incorporate technoscience not only as a site of research, but also as an actor in my studies. And I've done so through two complementary research lines. The first is really a critical examination of emergent technologies that posit the body, our body, as an interface between biology and information. If we have to talk about it today, we would say between biology and data, because information is no longer the word that we use. And here what interests me is trying to understand how different technologies, how different sciences recraft, produce and materialize values and facts and frameworks about how we think about our bodies, about our personhood, and about our agency. I'm interested in looking and to see how these facts and these values are negotiated and how they acquire both effective and effective power. And my goal has then been to understand the sociological and ethical frameworks that underlie the work of developers and then the work of users who take these technologies and make them their own. I have so far, as Anna said, looked at these issues in the world of wearable computers and quantified self. Now, my second research line focuses on something that is now much closer to my heart, and that's the study of the contemporary politics and practices of technoscience governance. I'm interested in analyzing how social sciences become integrated in large R&D projects, and what is their role and how they're evaluated. And by extension, what this means to us, because it changes how research is organized, it changes our social technical imaginaries, and it changes our interaction with actors such as society or the publics. And this is a theme that I started developing while doing a postdoc at Cornell University, where I found myself being the in-house social scientist, the lone in-house social scientist at a nanotechnology facility. And so it is this shift to politics that I want to talk to you about in the context of borders and boundaries and movements through space, through networks and through institutions. Now, as we know, borders and boundaries are in the order of the day. A few examples from the last month. Our own Prime Minister Antonio Costa just last week talked about the border with Spain as being a place of union and not a point of separation. And so here we're talking about geographical borders. There are also cultural borders that we are aware of, and in March of this year, the Dutch Minister of Economy, Jeroen, I don't know his surname, talked about how people like us in southern countries waste our money on women and booze and therefore should be punished for it. There's obviously an important issue going around in the world of economic and financial borders, and we're all aware that Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, wants to build a wall with Mexico. And then for us in this room, there's the issue of boundary work, that piece that is inescapable. Using Michel Caillon's words, it's an obligatory passage point for anyone who engages in STS. That is, the boundaries that we erect to keep some of us inside, keep others on the outside, and actually define what it means to do STS, who gets to do it and who does not get to do it. Now, all of these borders, and there are more, are key to understanding my work and my career. As many of you, my life, both personal and professional, has hinged upon constant border crossing. And geographically speaking, we're looking at something like this. In 1995, I moved from Portugal to Denmark to finish my BA. I was then an Erasmus student at the point when being an Erasmus student was something different. In 96, I moved to Barcelona to do a master's, and I stayed there for 2 years. I then go to Canada, to the University of Toronto, to do a PhD, where I stay until 2004, when I move to the United States, to Ithaca, New York, to do a postdoc. I then moved back to Canada as an assistant professor, and in 2012, at the height of the crisis in Europe, or at least in Portugal, I decide that I want to come back. Now, these are mainly geographical shifts, but there's also cultural changes, and there's anecdotal data that I can share with you on what it means to be an immigrant, to constantly being asked to learn other cultures. In Denmark, for example, I was taken for a Turkish woman and harassed while I was walking in the street. In Barcelona, it took me the longest time to understand that when my colleagues talked about the Iberian Peninsula, they actually were talking about Spain and not about Spain and Portugal. In Canada, after 2 months of being there, people kept asking me if I was Canadian, because Canadians are constantly worried about what it means to be Canadian. And of course, coming back to Portugal brings with it the unease of being Portuguese, and yet finding it strange to be here and having to ask questions that everyone seems to know the answer to. Of course, something else that can be seen from my travels is that my career choices have remained within the bounds of the Northern Hemisphere. And this is not, as Donna Haraway reminds us, innocent. There are reasons to stay within why I have stayed within the Northern Hemisphere. But another way to look at my travels has to do with moving from the margins to the center and back. I was in Portugal. I did most of my, I studied in Portugal and in Spain. I stayed in the margins. I moved a bit closer to the center when I went to do my PhD in Toronto, and then for a few years found myself at Cornell University, at the STS department at Cornell University. And I don't know if you guys know this, but the STS department at Cornell was founded in 1991, and it likes to brag about itself that it has contributed to the creation of the discipline of STS. It was actually one of the first, if not the first, STS department proper at a university. And so it was also the only place where I've worked where there was a very clear definition of what it means to do STS. And being at the center obviously has tons of advantage. There's the reputation of being at Cornell, there's the infrastructure of being there, the networks, and obviously the colleagues. This, being in North America, certainly allowed me to study the worlds of high technology. I was integrated within a center for nanotechnology. I got to study with colleagues and work with colleagues who were Nobel Prize winners. But it also has constraints, and one of them for me, and an important one for me, was that there was a need to conform to disciplinary definitions. And so there was the politics of working at Cornell weren't often complicated for me. But ironically, it was also at Cornell that politics became an important part of my career, because it was there, being the lone social scientist within a very large facility, that I started to actually really worry about what social sciences were becoming, what counts as scientific knowledge, who defines the role of the social sciences, and what the terms are for our funding arrangements. And so after all of this, at the height of our crisis here in Portugal, I decided to move back home. After 17 years, and this is where I'm at, and I'm quite happy about it. I was asked by the organizers to think about what it meant for me to return. And some of the things are obvious, but I've always worked mostly by myself, and therefore moving back wasn't a big issue. I do the same. I'm a bit more isolated here, but that's not a big problem. What has changed for me is that the politics of my work have become much more important. It is quite different to work at home, where it matters to me on a personal level. And so one of the things that has changed quite dramatically for me is actually this idea that I care about what I do here because it is my country, it is the country where my son lives, where he's going to grow up, where he's going to study, and that matters. And so when I was thinking about this, I kept thinking about Carrie Thompson, who in her book on making parents on IVF says that, and I'm quoting, I care greatly about patients and also about humans and quasi-humans, but I care about people more, cyborg they may be. And I kept thinking that the same is true for me. I care greatly about emergent technologies with their human and non-human actors, but I found I care much more about Portuguese technoscience and attempting to understand and intervene in its politics. Science became more personal to me. And this, I would say, is both gratifying and worrisome. I've spent most of my career working at a global, transnational, or a-national high-tech issues. I've looked at wearable computers and how they're developed and how they're used. I have an ongoing project with London, looking at how users in London quantify their bodies and measure themselves in order to achieve a better, more perfect, more scientific identity. And now I'm here and studying Portuguese academia and trying to understand how science is pursued and evaluated in Portugal. And obviously for me, that means also that I'm more isolated in the sense that it is a local issue that is interesting to a few other Portuguese academics. And that is scary. Shift is scary. And so what I've done is I've tried to find ways to keep one foot in each world. I continue looking at high tech. I continue collaborating with colleagues abroad. I continue looking at the quantified self. I've immersed myself also in examining how research is evaluated in Brussels. And I try to do my small work here and trying to see if the ways in which we organize academia in Portugal can actually change and be improved. And so I don't have much more to say about this. I guess we'll have time. But I'm hoping that I've reflected with you enough that it can give you an idea of where I'm at and some points for discussion. Thanks.
Last but not least, anyway, Tiago Moreira. Tiago Moreira is an associate professor of sociology at Durham University in the UK. He is trained in both sociology at the University of Lisbon, where he was my colleague and friend, and science and technology studies at Edinburgh. His interest in medicine began during his PhD in Lancaster, where he conducted an ethnography of neurosurgical practice. In the last 15 years or so, he has researched and published on the role of evidence in healthcare and the generation and implementation of healthcare standards. More recently, his research has focused on contemporary socio-technical articulations between aging and health. The floor is yours.
Okay. So I'm just going to speak in English. I was hesitating whether I should speak in Portuguese, but I think that part of being lost in translation is that I think I've lost the capacity to speak in Portuguese academic or in academic Portuguese. I think it's academic Portuguese, isn't it? And so it would sound odd. That's just a comment. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I think I'm going to give the take-home message first, which is my view of this conference, is that it's got the greatest title, because I think that we should celebrate. It's great. It is our duty and mission to be lost in translation as STSs. That's what we do best. We're lost between science and society. We're lost between doing and thinking. We're lost between all of those things. And being in between those things is exactly what we should do, always, all the time. So it's being at the boundary. And obviously boundary as Anna was referring to, has a huge tradition of conceptual tradition in STS, starting with boundary work, boundary object, but also the idea that boundaries have some generative capacity. Anne-Marie Moll and John Law talked about the fire space, which is part of that things that do not relate immediately, that we don't know exactly how things relate, and that is actually a good place to be. So that's part of the challenge that Anna was talking about, is that STS country has some ready answers and some ready methods, but obviously between STSs or within STSs we should be talking about what we can do better, and what we can do better is not to have ready answers, but to exactly live or survive sometimes in the culture of interstices. This is a quote by Stongers. I was wondering if I should give it in French, but that would be another language, so I gave it in English. And what she's actually arguing is that the culture of interstices, in being in between, being at the boundary, is not something that belongs to individual experience, that should be analyzed, in the concept of liminality, or something in which has some kind of passage that you are in between status and you experience that uncertainty. But it has to do with the gathering of what we know and what we can do. It becomes an environment for possibilities, i.e. something that we can explore, we can socialize, as she argues. And my take on this is that we can only do this by accepting two methodological principles of STS, the first principle of symmetry and the second principle of symmetry. And if we accept that as methodological principles, we are able to provide that thinking capacity, that exploration of possibilities that Stangers talks about. So that's the message to take home. You can go now if you don't want to listen to the rest of the other thing. So I think that in terms of how I experience this and why is it important that we have this role, is exactly to do with a personal transition. In 2002, I was employed by a medical school after doing a PhD in STS, and I must say that was a shock. I mean, it was a crisis, both on personal level, to be honest, but also on an intellectual level, because for those of you who've never worked in a medical school, medical schools are very hierarchical, are very structured, and they gather around, because they're incredibly interdisciplinary, or that's why they think of themselves as incredibly disciplinary. There's people that are interested in livers, people that are interested in cells of livers, there are people who are interested in populations, people who are interested in care. So how to gather those people together? One of the methods that is used is around the idea of method. So method is a way of gathering people. So everybody agrees on a variety of methods, from population longitudinal method to the qualitative methods, and we agree on those, on the definition of those, and how can be used for a variety of projects, like Anna was talking about, how things can be arranged. So you do the patient interviews, I do the measurement of liver function, etc., etc. So it's a culture of research driven by methods and measurement as resources, and by the pure avoidance of theory. A theory is seen as a problem, because theory can cause conflict, can cause division, can cause disaggregation of the school, and a lack of funding, which I guess is the problem. And most of all is driven by outcome. Outcomes, not only in outcomes research, but what comes out of the research in terms of clinical practice is incredibly important. If you can't show to make a difference to patients or to policy that affects patients, you are basically nothing. If you think about the mirror image of this, is almost STS. Resource, measurement and method are topics, not resources in STS. It's theory rich. It thrives, and it's driven by theory. Sometimes people say too much. There's kind of a conceptual inflation in the field, but it is a fact that the field is defined by its conceptual richness, conceptual focus, and by the focus on process. How do things come to be? How could it be otherwise, etc.? Those are the kinds of questions. So I've experienced this as a complete clash, as you can imagine. How could I speak? How could I provide? Measurement, a demonstration of methods? How could I avoid theory? How could I basically not speak about translation, boundary work, boundary objects? So I've learned to do this in two ways, and I'm going to give some examples. So one of the ways I've done to do this is by compromise. And the compromise, this is an example of the compromise in the study I've done of clinical practice guidelines, in which I had to study the process of making clinical practice guidelines in practice, observing meetings and the various background work of doing how do you come to design a particular standard, but I had to provide a way of describing it as through a method. And this is the method that I invented. The method that I invented was basically an adaptation of some theory, which I've hidden in the footnotes, and then a way of actually describing the meetings, that's the process of the meeting, as a representation. So if you have, I've described the discussions in the meetings as discussions about science, practice, politics, and process, and then you've got there the various colours that represent science, policy, etc., and how they evolved across the 10 to 11 meetings that takes to develop a national clinical practice guideline. Now, what this allowed me to do, right, to do this kind of compromise work, was to actually talk with clinicians and with health researchers that evidence, the science, was actually, I demonstrated that the science, which is the blue one, was important. Yes, was important. A lot of discussion was about science, evidence, important stuff like clinical trials, etc. But it was not the end-all of the process. And that allowed them to understand actually making a clinical guideline requires a lot of attention, particularly at the end, to the relationship, for example, between science and politics. How is this going to be received by the various political actors in the field? Now, I was unhappy about calling it politics. One of the reviewers in the journal, when I submitted Social Science and Medicine, said, "What's this division between science and politics? Have you not read Boundary Work by Thomas Guerin? You are a fool." Yes, I am a fool. I am an idiot, but I had to do it to be able to compromise, to do some work around it. The other one that I found to do is a careful misunderstanding. I don't have an example about it because I'm just going to talk briefly about it. And it's about being able to do an ethnography in a clinical a dementia clinic, an outpatient dementia clinic, to diagnose preclinical dementia by everyone pretending that they knew what I was doing and me pretending that I was doing what I was doing, when in fact everybody knew that I was doing something completely different. And this went from my authorization in what I was doing there, I was as a student, to what was my purpose of doing there. Now, this is what my former boss Karl May calls lubricating fictions, which obviously everybody knows from their life and their experience, that things that we all we pretend that we believe in so that life can continue to be as smooth as it is. But it is an important technique I learned to survive and to be able to do something such as an important ethnographic field work in preclinical dementia, which was not done at the time. Again, the same thing happened. I was able to show that a lot of the work in the clinic was hinged upon the idea that there would be that this work of diagnosing preclinical dementia would deliver in the future, had a promissory horizon of delivering in the future a treatment for Alzheimer's. And so everything worked on this premise. And what I demonstrated was that there was a lot of background work that involved care and involved people doing arrangements, practical arrangements in their lives, that was supported in a way by the funding, but also by the professional knowledge, by that people had developed in that clinic that only survived because he had the funding from the pharmaceutical companies, etc., etc., etc. So that was one work of compromise. But I also think that there is another possibility, which is the exploring something from within when you find a blind spot in your area of study, wearables, etc., etc. So when I was doing research on on dementia, I found that there were some really interesting people around, which were called at that time biogerontologists. Now, biogerontologists are probably not very well known, so there are people, biologists of aging, which have been around for a long time. Peter Medawar, everybody knows Peter Medawar here, right? Famous British scientist, Nobel Prize winner. The lecture that he wrote for his inaugural lecture at UCL was Aging, an Unsolved Problem in Biology, and he had identified the biology of aging as a key aspect in 1952. So they've been around for a long time. Why have we never heard of them? Right? They never heard of them because they're outside. So I identified with them because, like me, they were outsiders. So I identified with them. And I found that they had two very interesting things that they were doing. One thing is that they had for a long time, since the 1970s, they had been developing a critique of biomedicine. So in a way, I was looking at STS work on biomedicine, and I was looking at what biogerontologists have been doing since the 1960s, 1970s. I was like, well, it's actually quite similar. Also, they have been exploring the idea that what we live today, the way that we live today, is not natural, that it is socio-technical. They would put it in a different way, but it is socio-technical, that we live in a technological environment that allows us to survive beyond what they see to be what we were designed to live for. The 30 years that we would have lived when in the beginning of humanity. Right? So that creates a blind spot, because what can you do as an STSer with biogerontologists? Okay. That is a problem that I haven't solved. Okay? Now, biogerontologists have a particular problem or a particular issue because it's itself predicated in a very long promise of the plasticity of the human, of reinventing the human. If the human is itself an historical contingent thing that we have because of the technological conditions that we created, domesticating the human, allowing us to live beyond what we're genetically prepared to do, why is there not the possibility of modifying the humans genetically? And then obviously there has a long history that goes back to eugenics. Alexis Carrel, L'Homme wrote in 1933 a whole book about this, a whole book about how we would transform the humans. That has obviously repercussions now when we hear Silicon Valley millionaires reinventing these techniques and calling them transhumanism. I guess they call it now. So the problem here is STS, should STS be a conservative defense of old ways of being human? Saying, we shouldn't reinvent the human, that's bad. Or should we, like Steve Fuller, go and defend the ability to experiment with our nature and to reinvent the human by changing genetic and epigenetic ways of being human? Now, Can you? No. Yeah. Yes. So that would be, that's a graph from 1975 where Bernard Streller, one of the biologists of aging, posited the possibility of what would happen. Now, if you would have curve D, those are survivorship curves. So that means, that's the amount of people that are alive at each specific age for each cohort, right? So that last one would be that we would live on a squarish curve to 200 years on average, right? That would be probably a life expectancy of around 150 years. Right? So what would happen in our society, in our experience of ourselves, if that would happen? And what's our position? Now, one way of going about it is to say, well, perhaps there is a problem here is to look at the background work and say perhaps there's a different way of how they're measuring what is to be human, because they're measuring what is to be human by the amount of years we survive. Okay, so that is a measurement of health. Now, when we look at, can you? Yes, fourth. Now, this is a slide I use in my lectures in health and medicine, sociology of health and medicine. It's not much different from the way social scientists measure health. Right? This is a key example of how we measure. But this is a different thing. So one day, a biogerontologist said, well, I have a very, very good way, a very, very effective way of extending life expectancy. It's called money. Right? So we don't need drugs. What we need is to... But are those two sides of the same coin, in a way? So we're measuring the same way. We're valuing the same, which is living longer, right? And we're comparing ways of achieving. One by redistributing money, and another by giving people senolytics or drugs that change the way that the aging process goes. Now, my view, how long have I got?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. My view is that we shouldn't, and this is my view, there might be others, that we shouldn't take a stand, but that we should explore and open up what is at stake. And what is at stake here is the valuation of what's important for us. So what do we value? Right? So we value health by survival, right? And even if we measure it from other ways, quality of life, the variety of other ways of measuring health, we assume that health is the ultimate value. It's either health or money, right? And one can be converted into the other, right? So that is the ultimate value that we're measuring in two ways. How can we open that up? If we follow up the principle of double symmetry and we extend it, we say, okay, how would it be what are the places where health is not the ultimate value? Do we have any examples of that? Recently I was in Tomsk in a conference, and I've met one small example of that. People who fish for fish in rivers in Siberia are interested in a variety of things about fish, such as the fishing of the fish, such as being in the snow, being out, etc. But they're not particularly interested on the omega-3s or whatever that fish bring. It's not a healthy issue. Actually, eating those fish has a particular consequence, which parasitologists are concerned, which is that they have a particular parasite that affects the liver and might lead to liver cancer and affects some mortality. But when you say that to those people who fish in Siberia for leisure, that you should, take anti-parasites or you should cook the fish, they say that the most horrible thing that you could do to a fish is to cook it, because it makes you smell of fish and taste fishy, which we all know. Sardines, right, are fishy when we grill them, and they're not like that when we don't grill them. So what they do is they leave it in the snow or smoke it, and it doesn't smell of fish at all. And they eat it raw or very, very lightly smoked. And so in the discussions that we had with those fishermen, we know that they don't value that particular value of health, that is survival, not suffering from liver cancer and surviving to many years, but they do value fish, eating the fish. That might be an example of exploring that. It needs to be explored even more. There might be many other examples that you know of, but it's the only way that we have to open this, what we will call this lock-in that we have at the moment in health and what health is, and that is the ultimate value, right? We even say it every time in Portuguese. You know, we might not be, have money, but at least we've got our health, right? Yeah. And we're always valuing those things in that way. So how, if there is any work that we can do in this regard, from my point of view, is to actually open up the value of health to demonstrate how we can live unhealthily.
Thank you very much. Now to open the floor for discussion. I know that Vincenzo wants to ask a few questions first. Is that right?
Yes. I want to make a couple of comments and one question to the three speakers. I think that you have beautifully put together the many issues that exist and emerge around the issue of loss of translation. Each of you in your own way, and I think it really made a great contribution to what is going to be the discussion in the next few days. I have appreciated the idea of a couple of things that Thomas said about the limits of possibility and resources. Sometimes we have resources that you don't have the possibility, and the other way around. I thought that the idea of recalibration is something very powerful that we should always consider in all our movements, geographic movements, political movements, epistemic movements. I also found very, very important in the loss of translation discussion what Anna said about who gets left behind. It's one of the issues in the loss of translation, one of the most important ones, I think. And also the scientific challenges of us social scientists, we as social scientists, getting integrated in technoscience projects. This is more and more the case because of the way the governance of science is being reorganized, that make questions about what is lost and what is learned. And also the movement of between margins and the center that also spur a number of questions. And finally, what was Tiago's mentioning, I think that two or three issues that are very important. The STS is being in between. It's one of the most powerful possibilities, potentiality of STS, so to speak. And I especially like this idea of compromise and careful misunderstanding, because these are a way in which we use this as STSers everywhere we go, which is not our zone of comfort, so to speak. And this happens to most of us. But I have one specific question that I wanted to make to the three of you, because the situation of science, scientific governance, scientific evaluation, scientific financial regimes, and also expected outcomes of what is our work as scientists and STS is changing dramatically in the past years. Some people call that neoliberal education. This has been contested for a number of reasons. The fact is that we are being asked to adapt to a new and changing landscape of what is science governance and what is science expected to be. The question then is, how can we take this opportunity to, on the one hand, reflect about what we thought science was about, that is being challenged? How can we propose as STS, there's something that in many ways is a positive, constructive response to what is being asked when we don't agree, for example. Somehow jokingly, I was saying that I think we should all stop for a couple of years as science and say, we cannot conduct science under these conditions. I think we should sit together and think together what is science, or what we think science should be collectively. So that is the question. What can we do in a constructive response, having learned from our experiences, to this changing landscape of technoscience and science governance? That is my question.
I think we are going to take a few more questions from the audience before returning to the table. So we have one question there.
Yes, well, my question is a very concrete one, very difficult to answer, I guess, to Anna, is that you mentioned you've done some work on this role of social scientists in techno-scientific projects, and I would like to at least mention a couple of important points of your findings. I think this is just like asking you to make an abstract of many years' work, but I'd like to hear if, particularly from an STS point of view, something is changing in this kind of projects.
And another one there?
Yeah, so Tiago ended with a plea whether we could live unhealthily, and I would like to provoke a reflection on whether we can live unsymmetrically. And it's not the symmetry that worries me, it's this honorific that we wear, the honorific of interstitial. With this idea that it somehow appeals to a certain kind of progressive politics where we're sort of responsible for reconciliation, hybridity, and I don't think that's always necessarily true of what we do. You could easily think about this sort of positional politics of STS as being a lot about arbitration in a sort of very managerial state level, or even a sort of a meta exercise of sorts, which is the opposite of being, or what this politics appeals. But the reason I worry is because, having been 15 years away, I worry about the sort of homecoming experience of Anna, that the only way that we can somehow reconcile ourselves with politics is going back home. And us that are elsewhere, appealing to this interstitial place, do not elaborate a discourse that's meaningful enough to get us engaged in a new way. And I wonder, why don't we as STS appeal to other standpoints, as cosmopolitans, as internationalists? My worry, my provocation is whether are we lost in translation or are we lost in transit? That we somehow don't bridge all the way into a new space that is truly ours.
Anything else? Anyone else? No? Back to the table.
I mean, I guess those two questions are more or less linked, aren't they? What can we do? I know that my answer is unsatisfying, but that is my answer. I think that we can inhabit those particular spaces, and actually, in a way, we sometimes have to be non-confrontational. We have to be things that we don't associate with politics, because we don't associate it. We have to compromise, and compromise again, and negotiate, and give over, and rearrange the concepts, and pretend that we don't actually, and lie, right out lie. That's what we need to do to make a difference. Now, lots of people don't like the figure of the infiltrator, or the figure of those figures of the spy, all those, because those are not noble figures. You were speaking about being honorific and noble. Those are not noble figures, but I think the STSs in techno-scientific institutions of the present and the past have played those roles. I mean, Michel Calon advised various French socialist governments, mainly because the other ones didn't like him very much. But he advised many governments on various technological policies, and he had to play that role, even though he was unsatisfied. So I think we can, with our knowledge and with what we know and what we can do it. But it doesn't mean that we need to do it in one regime. That's why I said that they are socializing or doing politics by a variety of repertoires, as you might call it, a variety of styles, right? And one of them is to be the infiltrator, and to undermine, to ask questions. You know, the example that I gave of saying, well, you know, medicine, evidence-based medicine is not all about science. There's a lot of things going on here. That is a small thing. Yes. I sometimes think that sometimes we have, because we, I mean, and this is something that I think we can learn from actor network theory, is that we make the institutions so big that then we are powerless to because the institutions are so big. You know, if we say techno-scientific regimes, God, etc., they become so big that we really don't have ways, and sometimes we lose hope, and because we can't intervene possibly in any way. So we can intervene in small ways in our profession or in our work, etc., and we can intervene in other ways. I was just talking at this particular moment what I think would be the two styles that we could use in intervening when we are, by the politics of techno-scientific innovation and policy, that we are put in a position of always being the infiltrator. I don't think there's a problem there, but that's my view.
I'm actually going to disagree with you. I agree and understand that compromise is necessary, and that lying is fine. I have zero problems with engaging and doing my own ethnographic work that is actually different from what someone else thinks I'm doing. But that's only possible if there is if the playing field is leveled, if there are no power asymmetries built into the system. And part of the answer to the question about integration is that those power asymmetries are built, increasingly built into the system, such that there is very little room to actually be an infiltrator, to actually undermine. Because at the end of the day, the funding agencies, what they want to see from us is an output that has reached a consensus. And so it seems like we have to forget that as a social scientist, my objective is this, and as a natural scientist or as a chemist or as a physicist or as a medical doctor, you have different objectives. And at the end of the day, it seems like funding agencies force us to reach a consensus that actually undermines the richness of our knowledge. And that's probably one of the things that I've learned through this integration. I think part of the answer, so I don't disagree with you in the sense that when these engagements happen because they are voluntary, then that possibility exists. I mean, ethnographies have always relied on some level of deceitfulness. I mean, we can intervene and we do give back, but at the same time we are social scientists and we're interested in learning and creating theory, etc. But they've become increasingly mechanical, this idea that you put natural scientists, social scientists together and you're creating a solution. That has been, I find, problematic. It's problematic for me. It's this long-standing discussion in STS about, are we a service discipline that creates policy? I mean, is intervention, is making a difference necessary? I mean, I've increasingly found myself drawn to theory. I mean, after spending years working with natural scientists, I think intervention is necessary when it is necessary. Creating knowledge is increasingly necessary for its own sake. And so my problem is that we're moving towards a landscape of no consensus, of consensus only, of lack of disagreement being problematic, because that's what funding agencies want from us. That's what, in a sense, they seem to think the public expects. That means that we are evaluated in particular ways, and the power asymmetries remain in terms of funding, and that creates a landscape where it is increasingly hard as a social scientist to make a difference, if only to our own disciplines and in terms of contributing to our knowledge. And so I have found that integration is incredibly difficult, but I don't have another answer. I mean, we cannot ask scientists to disengage from the public, from the social. And so there is no easy answer. Part of the answer, I think, is more funding for social sciences, but that's an easy one, and that's probably something that we would all agree with. But that's not easy to do, and I'm not sure it will happen, because the funding agencies do want us to work with companies and create patents and come up with physical results, and that's hard when an ethnography takes 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so I'm ambivalent at best about how this whole thing is working out and what it's doing to social sciences. And having been in Brussels and looking at how projects are evaluated, and it's just absolutely maddening, you know, that projects have 30 activities and each of them has 20 outputs and reports and more reports, and it, you know, it's very hard to see where this is all leading us. And certainly, you know, the natural sciences complain about the same, so we're not alone there. And natural scientists do complain, and I think rightly so, that they are natural scientists, and we're asking them to engage with the public, to know about talking to the public, etc. And that requires skills and training, and we are trained to do that. So we cannot expect that everyone does it as well as we do, but it's complicated. I could go on, but I don't have Thomas.
Well, I think it's a tremendously difficult issue. And I don't know. I mean, I can only share some puzzlements and things that I would like maybe to invite us to think about. And I sometimes worry that in STS we are also often dealing with the politics of the reasonable, right? Engaging with discipline making, engaging with our institutions, and even thinking that what we do is what we do as social scientists. And that means that we are constantly subjugated to how social sciences are being measured by funding institutions, and then our role as social scientists is to do this or that, and then our role as social scientists is to negotiate these or that with professionals from, I don't know, well, STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine, to name one of the biggest clusters of things. But I have the feeling that in some other techno-scientific practices, people are as lost as we are. And they might not be really happy to be working within that the disciplinary, institutional, and funding scheme kind of setting. And I mean, I don't know, maybe it's a very extreme case, but in the last years I have been coming across loads of technical professionals, maybe because of the crisis in Spain or God knows what, that they have been doing things in a different way. They have moved from one space to another, from a space of certainty, disciplinarity, institutional backing, and certain kind of funding to uncertain positions, dragging themselves out of those equations, even delving into the unreasonable, into what some people might be, I don't know, believing that it will lead nowhere. And I don't know, I have the impression that that could be also another possibility. There is no need to maybe continue with these kind of institution building with elevator pitches of all kinds. Elevator pitches. Yeah. I mean, like presenting ourselves as we're going to save the world again. Yeah, here we are, social scientists making your life better since Auguste Comte or whatever. Yes. I have the impression that maybe we would need to drag ourselves out, at least to some extent. That is what I try to argue for these kind of third spaces, spaces that are beyond even institutional disciplines and regular modes of discussing. I think we would need to get lost way more. But I don't have an answer.
I remember, years ago at a conference here in Portugal talking to John Law, and we were talking about funding, and he said, I've decided I'm not applying for funding, and so all the projects I do are funded through either colleagues or just things that I'm interested in, and I just do them. And I guess that's more or less what you're saying, and I think that there is obviously one answer, and Portuguese academics must be very good at doing it because there's no funding. But it's really, it's not a solution, because there are problems that require us to be there. And I don't think social sciences have big answers to all the problems. But the world is more complicated now. You look at how things are in Europe, in the US, and in Africa, and we need to be there. And the answers we give may be partial, they may be even wrong, but we need to engage. And to engage, we need some funding. And if we're going to get funding, then we have all these rules and to follow. So I'm with you in that alternative third spaces are necessary, and we certainly need to think about those and encourage those. But there's a real, that's it. I think it's a good answer, but it's not enough, right? We need more. We need to be able to transform the spaces we have also, and just actively work towards better funding, regulations, etc. For those of you who are Portuguese, we've all been consumed by the new FCT projects, and if for anyone who opened that, to try to fill those forms, we know how incredibly bureaucratic the whole funding system has become. But we also saw very few people complain about it in the media, whatever. We went through hell for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month to produce a project that is not going to be funded in all likelihood because there's no money. But, we're the highest educated class in Portuguese society. We have PhDs, and yet the government says we need to go through these forms that are meant for businesses that ask for things that most of us have never heard of, and we do it. And so there's clearly something that we're not doing well in terms of actually being more engaged. And I don't know, we have to, I think we do need to be more forceful in changing our reality. And part of that is what Tomás is saying. It's about creating different alternatives, but part of it is also engaging with what's going on now and ensuring that our voices get heard. And you've done that much more than I have, because I know your work in Barcelona, etc. So I'm preaching to the choir. But I do think that's still necessary, and perhaps more so now than ever, when facts have become alternative.
Can I just add something? I think that I was giving the example of biology surveying as an example for us to as an example for us to learn from, because biology surveying have been trying to transform biomedicine since the 1950s, and they've tried from below, from the side, from infiltrating as secret agents, and they have understood the infrastructure of institutions. They've criticized it. They've, from an economic point of view, from a health point of view, from a sociological point of view, from a biological point of view. Actually, they say biomedicine, biologically, it doesn't really make sense to focus on disease by disease because you're just peeling the layers of the onion, right? So it doesn't make sense biologically. It doesn't make sense in any sense. They've criticized it. They've created various attacks from more political to less political, to more visible to less visible. I won't bore you with the details, both in the United States and in Europe. And the lesson that I learned from them is a humbling lesson. Is that, as you can see from that picture, aging treated. Do you want to put it? Aging. The woman jumping onto the lake, right? So that is a Nature feature news about the first trial that has been done on aging. Now, in the US, you can't do a trial on aging because aging is not a disease, so therefore you cannot actually license something to treat something that is not a disease. So how they created this after many years of saying, well, you know, the difference between aging and disease is really conceptual, is boundary work, as we would call it. They said, well, it prevents a wide range of conditions, right? And that's how they are transforming. They see they've been transforming medicine is by, you know, being the secret agents, infiltrators, and working from within. You know, many people have confronted it from, you know, Bernard Streller, very, very famous biologist of aging, did it very publicly. It did cost him his career, but he did it very publicly, confronted it very publicly, tried to do it outside of institutions. You know, within 1970s, United States, someone that had been trained in the 1940s. So, you know, deinstitutionalization was not his forte, right? But he tried it. And so I really take a humble lesson from it, that we sometimes think that we can transform an institution as powerful as biomedicine, but other people might say, well, actually, you can do it in different ways. It's not, you know, I don't disagree at all about confronting, about speaking out, denouncing, even public critique. I think that those things are really important, but I think that this technique is actually a really important technique, the secret agent technique. As Joseph Conrad taught us.
Yes, very briefly, because we want to break for coffee break. No, very briefly.
No, I mean that I am well aware that you know, fighting for funding and institution building is super important. I mean, I had to leave because I had none, but at the same time, I had the feeling that has transformed me again back into something I don't know whether I wanted to be, back to being a social scientist. Period. And I don't know. I mean, everybody in Spain is, I mean, or many people in Spain are completely obsessed with, you know, taking the institution, taking power back, and all these kinds of things, which is obviously, yeah, of course. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable and understandable. People have no jobs. The Spanish R&D system is completely bankrupt. Hasn't had funding for years. But at the same time, I don't know, I still remember that in the last years, even with little or no funding, I'm not advocating for scarcity and austerity, or I'm not advocating to being, a guinea pig of neoliberal government. But I really believe that there are ways, and that people have been doing incredible things outside of, I mean, I'm not saying completely outside of institutions, but creating hinges in between moments and spaces. Well.
I think I would just say, so it seems to me like we're all agreeing that in a sense you have to engage at all these different levels. I mean, there's no one solution, and you intervene slowly, sometimes by infiltrating, sometimes by paying attention to issues that haven't been studied. I mean, funding has remained understudied in social sciences, but sometimes you engage, I mean, there's all these different ways, and that seems to me like what we're agreeing in is that all these different ways have some good aspects and some worse aspects, but we need to do them all. And that's, I think, fantastic.
Anything else from the audience, or shall we break for coffee break?
Thanks.